Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's good to see people back for another day of learning. This is the Book of Deuteronomy, Telling and Retelling, the third session with Rabbi David Silber, part of Falzman at Drisha. For this class, join Rabbi Silber as he delves into Deuteronomy, a quote, new version of an old story. Sources for today's class will be shared on screen from Sefaria, but if you have your own preferred Tanakh or Chumash, you're certainly welcome to follow along. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much. All right, so we have started our study of the book of Devarim. First verse, Elo HaDvarim, these are the words that Moshe spoke. And we saw already last week that the book of Devarim seems quite different from the rest of the Torah. In this book, it doesn't say, for example, that God spoke to Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe. Rather, it reports everything from the viewpoint of Moshe. These are the words that Moshe spoke, Elo HaDvarim. And one of the questions when one studies the book of Devarim is whether the book of Devarim, to what extent the book of Devarim is taking into account the books that precede it. Because we see every story in Sefer Devarim seems to differ, sometimes differ very greatly from and contradict even what is reported earlier. So this raises the question in general. The book of Devarim, to what extent does it see itself as responding to what came earlier? To what extent is it simply a different version of what took place earlier? That's a very important question when one studies the book. Our position will be that we're going to look at the book of Devarim in and of itself. We're not trying to resolve the contradictions. Whether that's possible or not is a different question, but that's not what we're going to be doing. Rather, we're going to see how the book of Devarim represents some of the things that took place in the past. The book tells us this: Moshe's words or speeches are taking place towards the very end of the 40 years in the desert, and I would also add towards the end of Moshe's life. So we have to take that into account. Now, just to review very briefly what we saw last week, what we've been focusing on is how the book begins. Moshe is telling the story of what happened to the people, but the two things that the first chapter focuses on are, number one, the appointing of the judges, and number two, the story of the episode of the so-called spies, the Meraglim. That's how Moshe begins. He doesn't begin with stuff that took place much earlier. He doesn't talk about the exodus from Egypt. It doesn't talk about the splitting of the sea. It doesn't talk about receiving the Torah, standing at Sinai. Not over here. That comes later. But over here he starts with the judges and the episode of the spies. And I just want to suggest that the reason for that is, well, actually, before I suggest, I want to make a different point. And that is, to whom is Moshe speaking? Elo HaDvarim. To whom is he talking to? Well, we're told that this takes place towards the very end of the 40 years. So presumably the people he's speaking to are those people that are present at the end of the 40 years. But who are those people? So those people presumably are, for the most part, not the people that left Egypt. The people that left Egypt die in the desert. In fact, that is the lengthy chapter 14 in the book of Bamidbar, where after the spy episode, God is very angry, and God says they will not enter the land, and Moshe intercedes on behalf of the people. Moshe intercedes and recalls God's attributes of mercy. We first encounter the attributes of mercy in the story of the golden calf, where God threatened to destroy all the people, and Moshe intervenes on our behalf. And we have a parallel story in the episode of the spies, which is chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Bamidbar. There Moshe also recounts, or actually not precisely, but we have over there some version of these attributes of mercy. And God agrees that the people will not be destroyed, but all those that left Egypt will not see the land. They will die in the desert. And that's going to take place over 40 years. The spies had traversed the land for 40 days. And God tells Moshe in Bamidbar, chapter 14, Yom L'Shana, Yom L'Shana, 1 year for each day. They're going to stay in the desert for 40 years, but their children, whom they thought would never come to the land, they will be the ones to inherit the land. So presumably, and then it says anybody over 20, that edict was effective for anybody over 20. In other words, there were some younger people, presumably, who left Egypt who were still alive. But the great majority of people are children who grew up in the desert, not those that left Egypt. So then we can presume, as we start our study of the book of Devarim, that the people Moshe is speaking to are not the Jews that left Egypt, but rather their children. That is the audience. That's fairly clear. The only problem with that is, when we read through Sefer Devarim, it doesn't sound that way. It sounds like the people that Moshe is speaking to were also in Egypt, saw God's wonders in Egypt, perhaps God's wonders crossing the sea, etc. They experienced God in the past, and Moshe speaks to them in that way. And yet, on the other hand, it sounds like, from the beginning of the book, that the audience being addressed was never in Egypt. For the most part, these are children who grew up in the desert. So we have to keep that in mind at all times. That's one of the basic questions in Sefer Devarim. To whom is Moshe speaking? I'll give you one example of this, which is very glaring. And we're going to get to it later. It's not the topic for today. I'll simply mention it now. That the way last week we divided the book up into its various sections. And in chapter 5, I'm just going to mention this now. We're going to get into it next time. But chapter 5, we have Moshe recalls the 10 Commandments, as they're known, Seret HaDibrot. And there's a retelling of the 10 Commandments. When we get to it, we'll see the differences between the commandments as recorded in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, and the commandments in chapter 5 of Sefer Devarim. But the introduction to the 10 Commandments, I'll just read it to you. Chapter 5. Hashem Elokeinu, verse number 2, I'll read it to you. Hashem Eloheinu karati monu brit b'chorev. Lo et avotenu karat Hashem et abrit hazot, ki itanu, anachnu, ele po hayom kulanu chayim. Panim b'fanim diber Hashem imachem bahar mitoch ha'esh. Anochi omei ben Hashem uvenechem ba'et hahi, lagid lachem et dvar Hashem, ki reitem mipnei ha'esh, v'lo alitem bahar lemar. Now, I will translate these verses. We'll deal with them later, not now. I just want to make one small point. The translation in the JPS is chapter 5, verse 2. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Chorev is Sinai. It was not with our fathers that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, the living, every one of us who is here today. Face to face, God spoke to you on the mountain out of the fire. I stood between the Lord and you at that time to convey the Lord's words to you. You were afraid of the fire and did not go up the mountain, etc. So what is Moshe saying here? Moshe says that event that took place at Sinai, the receiving of the Torah, the revelation of Sinai, the covenant of Sinai. There wasn't a covenant that God made with your parents, with your ancestors. No. God spoke to you face to face. Now the question is, what in the world does that mean? What do you mean God didn't make the covenant with your parents? The ones who stood at Sinai were the parents. Maybe some of these people were at Sinai, but the parents were certainly at Sinai. What does it mean God did not make the covenant with them, but rather with us, those here today, we the living? That's a fundamental question in the book of Devarim. Once again, to whom is Moshe speaking? And I just say one word about this now. We'll deal with this in much more depth later, obviously. But the question is, when we say God spoke to X, God didn't speak to your ancestors. God spoke to you. Here, there's something that's very important about the book of Devarim. Moshe speaking to the children, to the fourth generation which will possess the land. And what Moshe is saying is the people who stood at Sinai, they were at Sinai, of course, but they didn't really experience Sinai. In other words, because if they really understood Sinai, they wouldn't have done what they did. And the same thing is true of the experience of Mitzrayim, of being in Egypt. The people who left the land of Egypt, the Exodus, never understood what it means to be in Egypt. Because if they truly understood what it means to be in Egypt, to be a slave in Egypt, Gerut, Avdut, and Inui, why would they always want to go back? It's only the people that weren't there, it's the people that were not there, who have the perspective, who can understand, having not been there, who can place it into a kind of perspective. They have the critical distance to place it in the proper perspective. I mention this now for other reasons, which I'm not going to get into now, but I just want to make a comment about this very point, which is, I think, an incredibly important point for the book of Devarim, and in general, I think a very interesting point. And that is, on one hand, the people who were in Egypt, the actual slaves, they endured the slavery. They understand slavery in a way that we can't understand because they experienced slavery. The people who experience suffering, whether it's slavery in Egypt, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's all kinds of tragedies that befall the Jewish people, whether it's October 7th, I mean, whatever it is, the people who are there can understand it, experience it in a way that those who are not there can't. As much as we try to put ourselves there, and we try in our tradition to put ourselves there, but it's not possible to be fully there because we didn't experience it. On the other hand, the people who were not there, who have a distance, who dafka were not there, they have a perspective that the people who are inside can't have. So it actually cuts both ways. And the book of Devarim actually, I think, picks up on the second point. God spoke to you at Sinai, says Moshe, not to the ones who were actually there. Because the ones who were actually, yes, they did experience it, of course, in a way that we can't. On the other hand, the perspective they don't have. And that's true about a lot of things. It's true about the Chumash. It's true about in any tradition. It's true about study of Torah, that there are people who are inside it. In the yeshiva, you're inside it. And then there are people who are not inside it, maybe very distant from it, but they have a different perspective and they ask different kinds of questions. And actually, we need both. We need people who can ask the questions from a distance, and we need people who are inside it, who are committed to it. And those are two very different, they bring two very different things to the text. And I think they're both really, really important, and we try to learn from both. In any event, I simply make this comment in the context of Sefer Devarim. Sefer Devarim is addressing people who were not there. They weren't there. But it addresses them because they can understand it. And that's true of Sefer Devarim from beginning to end. And I mentioned one last point about this related point, which is at the end of Sefer Devarim, it talks about bringing the first fruits to the temple. And the person that brings the first fruits to the temple makes a declaration, Arami Oved Avi, which is the core text of the Passover Haggadah. It's Dafka, the person that wasn't there. The text of the Haggadah is chosen from the book of Devarim, not from Exodus, from Sefer Devarim, for the Jews who were not there, which is us. And it looks at it from that perspective, from our perspective. Having not been there, we can place it in a much broader perspective and understand the significance of the Exodus. So anyway, coming back to Sefer Devarim, so that the one core question in Sefer Devarim is, who is the audience? We'll see this comes up over and over again. It's a very, very important point. And the second point I want to make about Sefer Devarim, I didn't mention this last week. This is a very important point. That Sefer Devarim presents itself as the words of Moshe. It's Moshe's telling of this, it's Moshe's perspective on the story. And as we read through it, every story doesn't seem to line up very well with the initial stories. And one can read that, of course, as a separate tradition. That's one way to understand it. One can also read it, I think, as a kind of interpretation. And when you see it as a kind of interpretation of the past, then Sefer Devarim becomes, interestingly, a bridge between what we call Torah Shebichtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. We have in Jewish tradition, what is central to Jewish tradition is this idea of a kind of a interpretive tradition, Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's not just the written word, but it's the license we have, I would say the obligation we have to interpret, to try to understand how the Torah continues to speak over time. New situations arise, new thinking arises, etc., etc. And from that perspective, one way to understand Sefer Devarim is exactly the beginnings, in a sense, of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Because these are Moshe's words. This is Moshe's interpretation. This is Moshe's take on the past. And this suggests that, yes, Moshe is the greatest of the prophets, but it's presented as one man's take on the past, as unique as he may be. But this can be seen as sort of an opening, an introduction to what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, the kind of interpretive tradition. So I want to make those 2 points that I didn't emphasize last week about Sefer Devarim and why it's such a special book and why it's such an important book within our tradition. Okay, let me just stop here for a moment. If there are any comments or questions about what I just said or from last week, speak up now. And afterwards, we'll continue with our study. We'll finish up chapter 1 and move into chapter 2.
David, question.
Yeah.
These points that you make, are they written down anywhere?
Are they written down anywhere?
Have you listed these anywhere in any organized
I haven't
fashion?
written them. I don't think I've written. I don't write too much. I mean, what I mentioned about the Haggadah comes up in the Haggadah,
Right,
which
right.
which I'm in the process of revising and having a second edition. But I think other people have. There's a lot of stuff about seeing Sefer Devarim as the beginnings of Torah Sheba'al Peh. I can try to find who talks about this. I myself have dealt with some of these questions in the Haggadah, but there's a lot of there's a lot written and spoken about these 2 points, especially the idea of seeing Sefer Devarim as a kind of introduction to Torah Sheba'al Peh. I think that is. Let me mention one book. Well, it's a rather lengthy book. This Rabbi Granot from Israel, Tamir Granot, maybe you've heard of him.
From Gush.
He's a Rosh Yeshiva. He was from the Gush originally. He's in Rabbi Shurlaus. He's Rosh Yeshiva of Rabbi Shurlaus Yeshiva. I think it's called Orot Shaul. And he has a book. He has lectures on Sefer Devarim. And he just recently came out with a book. Now, the book is 905 pages long. So it's not a small book. And but it's very interesting. And he takes a similar approach to what I'm saying over here in terms of seeing Devarim in its own right. So he discusses these issues in the book. It's again 900, but there's plenty of other discussion of it as well. I have to look and see where. It's to me, it's all Torah Sheba'al Peh. But yes, these are the first question. I don't know who discusses that about what is the audience that is being spoken to. I've talked about that very often, but the other point about seeing this as a kind of introduction to Torah Sheba'al Peh, that is discussed. I have to search and find it. If I come across it, I'll send you an email. Anybody else with any questions or comments?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I'm confused about which generation started complaining pretty immediately after we left Egypt. That was the slave generation, wasn't it? Who said, let's go back. So
right. Yes, the main complaints, the golden calf and the spy episode, take place in the first year. And those, first year, second year, that's essentially the generation that leaves Egypt. The generation that's going to possess the land is the second generation, or I'd say the fourth generation. There are 3 generations of suffering in Egypt, and the 4th generation was never in Egypt, and they're going to possess the land. And that was the covenant made with Abraham, Dor Revi'i Yashuvu Hena. So It's last week's parsha, actually, covenant of the pieces. The fourth generation shall return to the land. We're going to mention that later. However, it's also true that the fourth generation also complains. So complaining is not unique to the generation that leaves Egypt. Maybe we'll touch upon that even today, about the complaints of the next generation. The next generation's complaints are of a different order, though. Perhaps we'll either get to that today or we'll get to that next time. But yes, so the generation that leaves Egypt, I call the third generation, and they die in the desert, almost all of them. And then there's their children. And that's the children are the ones that Moshe seems to be addressing in this book. Of course, it's taking place at the end of the 40 years. And let me just add one more point, which will come across. Obviously, it's very central to the book, which is that when you're reading the book of Devarim, and Moshe is speaking in the very end of the 40 years, what that means is that these people are going to possess the land. The generation that leaves Egypt dies in the desert. The fourth generation will possess the land. And what Sefer Devarim is about, especially when you get to the section 3, which is the main section of the various commandments, etc., goes on for many chapters through chapter 26. It's all about setting up your own society. The book of Devarim is largely about what happens when you come into the land. How do you set up your society? What kind of people are in the government? We saw judges already in the very beginning. There were judges. They're going to be prophets. They're going to be priests. There's going to be a king. We encounter the institution of kingship for the first time in Sefer Devarim. And what Moshe is doing over here is describing the setting up of our own society. And then the question is, one of the big questions we'll come across is, where is God in all this? That's a very, very important question. When you set up your own society, where is God? In the desert, we know where God is. God walks with us in the desert. There's the Mishkan. We dwell around the Mishkan, and God is at the center. As it says in the book of Vayikra, I will walk amongst you. But in Sefer Devarim, God does not seem to walk amongst us at all. In fact, God seems to be up in heaven someplace. And we visit God's home a few times a year. But fundamentally, it's describing a different kind of world. Not a world in which God is immanent and present amongst us, a world in which God watches from a certain distance, perhaps from a great distance. So these are the core issues in Sefer Devarim. I want to mention them at the very beginning, but it's largely about, this is the generation that's going to go into the land and set up society. And what Sefer Devarim is about is, unlike the other books, what does this society look like? That's a very central question. What does this society look like? So we'll get to all these things. But the first 4 chapters, he discusses what happened in the past. And he starts with the spy episode. And the reason he starts with the spy episode is because the spy episode is the episode in which God says explicitly that the people that left Egypt will not possess the land. They're not going to possess the land. So, and this new generation will possess the land. So that's how Moshe starts. Moshe says, essentially, I'm talking to you people who very soon are going to cross over the Jordan and possess the land. And I want to warn you about what might lie ahead. And I want to warn you about what happened in the past. Don't make the same mistakes, etc., etc. So that's why the book begins where it is. And the first thing he says is, when you get into the land, make sure there's some kind of system of justice. You try to set up a just society, not any old society. There are people living there right now who I plan to throw out because their behavior is inappropriate. Don't behave as they did, or else I'll throw you out. That's what the Torah says. And the first thing is the judges. Shvachatem tzedek, that's verse number 16. I commanded the judges to judge fairly. Judge fairly. Don't favor anybody. Don't be afraid. If you don't know what to do, ask me, etc., etc. That's how the book begins. So this is all by way of framing the book of Devarim. This is what this book's about. It's a unique book, and it's a unique situation in the Torah because God does not walk amongst us in Sefer Devarim. God is up in heaven. And the question is, what is the relationship to this God who's much more distant? These are questions we'll deal with. Okay. That's by way of just finishing up
I
a
have
couple.
one
Yes.
comment.
Yes.
The first pasuk of Dvarim אלה הדברים אשר דיבר משה אל כל ישראל בעבר הירדן.
Yes.
And just including בעבר הירדן sets the situation that you're describing. They're now about to cross the Yarden.
Yes, that's very true. That's right.
And
Ever
it's not,
Hayarden, by the way, in the Torah, Ever Hayarden sometimes means the east side of the Jordan, and sometimes it means the west side of the Jordan. But over here it refers to the east side of the Jordan. The others, right? We haven't yet crossed over. We're about to cross over, but not quite yet. And what you say is very, very correct. That it's all preparatory to crossing over.
exactly.
It's going to take place very, very soon. Moshe is going. This is the 11th. There are only two. Moshe has 2 more months left, and after the end of the book, he's going to ascend the mountain and turn over the reins to his protege Yoshua. So that's the framing of the book. It's someone at the end of his life, looking back at his life, and looking at the positives and the negatives, and thinking about the future, how the people will move forward without Moshe. That's a very important point. He says this explicitly. I'm not going to be with you. You got to figure out how to behave when I'm not with you. And we'll come across all of these things. This is very, very central to us.
David,
Yes.
So one question. Moses tells God really pretty clearly. He said, "Lo ish dvarim anochi."
Yes.
And in his first encounter with God, and this,
Yes.
and now here he is prolix. I mean, he's got a whole book and he's got a lot to say. Do we deal with, or should we deal with, or are we expected to see an evolution? And do we touch on it, or maybe not now? The difference that these years have made. So now he doesn't stop talking. He's so impelled and has so much he wants to pass on. And at the very beginning, when he's got God really right in front of him, he pushes God away, tries to, and says, "Look, I'm not the one you want. I loathe Arianoki." So how do we deal with that dichotomy?
Well, the way you dealt
book
with
of
it,
Devarim, which is
I think it clearly Elah Dvarim does play off Lo ish Dvarim Anochi. Lo ish Dvarim Anochi was said in the beginning of his career, and he learned over the 40 years through his experience. He becomes, I mean, for a man who's not an ish Dvarim, I will say that even before you get to Sefer Dvarim, he is the most eloquent defender of the Jewish people that ever existed. So he's, and by the way, the Ish Devarim, it's actually, just to pick up on your point, that when it comes to defending the people, which he does both in the Golden Calf episode and in the episode of the spies, and he negotiates with God, he argues with God. He's also capable of saying very few words. When it comes to his sister Miriam, El na Rafan Allah is all he says, 5 little words. So the Ish Devarim knows also when to limit the words. The true orator understands that there's time for oration, and there's time for very few words, and there's time for silence. But I would say, to your point, that he, over the 40 years, he's a different person. He has become a defender of the people, which is why he speaks. He's a defender of the people. He's a negotiator with God, and it's a story about Moshe. The book of Devarim is Moses' book. Let's not forget that, and we'll come across this in a couple of other times as well. This is Moshe's book, and it's Moshe's life. Moshe's looking back at his own life, because his own life and the life of the people have become intertwined to the degree that he's going to suffer for his, in a certain sense, a tragedy, because his lot is the lot of the people. Can't be distinguished from the lot of the people, which leads me right into a verse that we find in chapter 1 of Devarim. Chapter 1 of Devarim, of course, we started this last time, and the people refused to enter the land. We have the episode of the spies. We discussed last week the many differences between the two accounts. And now we have, if you look at chapter 1, in verse number 30, let's start with verse number 34. Chapter 1, verse 34. This is after the people have said we can't go into the land, etc., etc. And Moshe has said to them, I told you not to be afraid. But they refused to listen to Moshe. And in verse 34, Vayishma Hashem et kol divrechem, Vayitzof Vayishava lemar. Im yireh ish v'anoshim ha'elu hador hara zeh, et ha'aretz ha'tova asher nishbati l'teit lavo tech suoti kolei ben yifunehu yireno v'lo atein et ha'aretz asher darach bo uvanav yan Hashem ilei acharei Hashem. So God heard your words, and God was very angry, and God took an oath, which is also in the book of Bamidbar. God takes an oath, and God's oath is, I swear, says God, that none of these people, this generation that left Egypt, will see the land that I swore to give to their ancestors. In other words, I did swear to give the land to their ancestors, but I didn't necessarily swear to give it to this generation. So the oath is a kind of a counter oath. There's an oath that Israel will possess the land. Then there's the counter oath that this generation will not possess the land except for Kalev. Let's leave Kalev out for now. But it's the next verse. Gambi hitanaf Hashem biglalchem lemar, gamata lo tavo sham. Yoshua ben Nun ho'omed lefanech hu yavo shama, oto chazek. Ki yanchilena et Yisrael. Says Moshe, and God was angry at me. Biglalchem sounds like on account of you, saying, you also shall not go there. So this is actually a very striking verse, because for two reasons. First of all, Moshe says, God was angry at you, and you will not possess the land, but God was also angry at me on your account. You also will not go. Two problems. First of all, when you read the Chumash earlier, it sounds like the reason Moshe will not enter the land is that business about the rock and hitting the rock or talking inappropriately, whatever the particular crime was over there, but had nothing to do with the spies, had to do with hitting the rock. When you read this version over here, it sounds like Moshe saying it's because of the spy episode when God was angry and said, you won't enter the land, I was included as well. So it sounds like it's not about the rock business, it's more about the spy business. That's what it sounds like. And what does it mean, biglalchem? Why should Moshe not enter the land? Because they're not entering the land. Those are two separate questions. As far as the first question is concerned, once again, that per se doesn't bother me, although I will say that in the book of Devarim itself, it mentions the reason that Moshe will not enter the land because of the incident of getting water out of the rock. The book of Devarim itself mentions that. So that's a good question. In other words, there seems to be an internal contradiction within Sefer Devarim. Now, there's a way to resolve this contradiction, and that is to say that Moshe is the leader of the people. And as a leader of the people, if the people are not entering, Moshe's fate is intertwined with the people. So biglalchem means if you're not, I'm your leader. So if you're not going in there, I'm not going in there. And I would add to this, 2 points. First of all, that the spy episode, as we saw last week, and unlike the description of the spy episode in the book of Bamidbar, in the book of Bamidbar, it's God who instructs Moshe to send the spies. But in Sefer Devarim, it doesn't say that God instructed anything. The people go to Moshe, and Moshe agrees. So in a certain sense, one could say that the spy episode, which ended badly, that wasn't Moshe's intention, but at the end of the day, he in fact authorized the spies to go in, and therefore whatever happened in the spy episode, he takes responsibility, because without his authorization, it would never have happened. But that's one point. But the other point is that actually another way to understand this, and actually to reconcile the two stories in a sense, is to say that the reason Moshe does not enter the land is not because of a particular sin, but rather because he's not the appropriate leader for the next generation. The next generation is going to conquer the land. The next generation needs a military man to run it, etc. and that Moshe is tied in with the generation that leaves Egypt. So he can only bring them so far. As far as they go, he will go. But in any event, my point is that you see the connection between Moshe, his own personal life, and the people that he has been commanded to lead. We remember, of course, that Moshe initially didn't want this job. He refused in so many different ways. At the end of the day, he accepts it. And that changes his life because his destiny is tied in with the people. If they're going to die in the desert, he's going to die in the desert. So, but in any event, what's interesting is that when you read this verse, you get the sense from this verse anyway, that the reason he's not entering the land is because of the incident of the spies. This says nothing here about hitting any rocks or anything like that. It's about the spies. When God decreed you could not go in this incident of the spies, I also can't go. And I add, because in the description over here, it's Moshe that actually authorizes them. He said the matter was, I went along with it. If I went along with it, I take responsibility. So that's what we have over here in terms of Moshe's connection to the people that he takes out of Egypt. Again, Yoshua and Kalev are mentioned. Yoshua will be the leader. Oto Chazek, your task is to strengthen him. We'll get to that later. Moshe does have a task of preparing Yoshua to lead, as described later in the book of Devarim and as described in the book of Bamidbar. And then the command in verse number 40, Penu lachem usu hamidbara derech yam suf. As for you, turn about and march into the wilderness by the way of Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. Fine. So this is the end of the spy episode, except this is not the end. We have at the end of chapter 1, beginning in verse number 41, and to the end of the chapter, Moshe recalls for us another incident. Very interesting incident. This is so the people have been told they will not possess the land. They didn't want to possess the land. They're afraid to possess the land. In the book of Bamidbar, by the way, they even say, let's go back to Egypt. Here they don't say, let's go back to Egypt. In the description over here, it doesn't say that. But in this spy episode, much longer spy episode in Bamidbar, chapters 13 and 14, there the people say, let's nitna rosh v'nashuva Mitzrayim, let's appoint a different leader and go back to Egypt. Here we don't have that. But here we do have the following parallel story, beginning in verse number 41. So let's pay attention to this, beginning in verse number 41. Vatanu vatomu elai, chatanu Hashem. You responded and said to me, we have sinned against God. Anachnu na'revenu chamnu. We will go up and fight. K'chol asher tzivanu Hashem Eloheinu, as God commanded us. Vatachgeru ish et klei milchamto vatohinu la'alo tahara. Each one put on his weapons, his war gear. And now vatohinu is a difficult word. Vatohinu, here they translate vatohinu, it's a literal translation, recklessly started for the hill country. Vatohinu, the commentaries, the Mefarshim relate to the word hineni, and they declared themselves ready to fight. They're walking up the mountain with their ammunition, with their gear, with their uniforms, etc. But they started by saying, we have sinned. Chatanu Hashem, they confess, it's true, we sinned. We did the wrong thing, we sinned. Now we're ready to do what God told us to do. That's verse 41. In verse 42, Vayomer Hashem Elai Emolahem Lo Talu V'lo Tilachamu Ki Eineni B'kirbechem V'lo Tinagfu Lifnei Ovechem. God said, do not go up, do not fight. I'm not going with you. I'm not in your midst. You'll be defeated. You'll be routed by your enemies. Don't go. And Moshe says, I told you this, and you refused to listen, to hear what I was saying, to accept what I was saying. Shmatim, to accept. Vatamru et pi Hashem, vatazidu vatalu ahara. You rebelled against God's word. Here they try to flouted. Vatamru, to rebel. Vatazidu, you brazenly went up to the mountain. disregarded what God said. Don't go. I'm not with you. And the Amorite that was dwelling on the mountain came to greet you, to meet you. And they caused you to run away, as here translate bees, probably wasps. As wasps do, they attack in bunches. And they defeated you. They crushed you at Charmah in Seir. You returned and cried before God. But God refused to hear your cries. God paid no heed. This is the story that appears here in Devarim, beginning in verse number 41. And there is a parallel to this in the book of Bamidbar. After the spy episode in Bamidbar, which is chapters 13 and 14, if you look at Bamidbar, we will see that there's a parallel, very, very similar story, not quite identical, but very, very similar to what we have over here. This is found in chapter 14 of Bamidbar, beginning in verse number 39. So God has told Moshe that people are going to die in the desert. They're not going to enter the land. They'll wander for 40 years. Their children will possess the land. And now in chapter 14 of Bamidbar, verse 39, Vaydaber Moshe et hadvarim ha'ela al kol bnei Yisrael. Moshe said these to the people. Vayitabru ha'am ma'od. And the people were very mournful. They were overcome by grief, avelut. Vayashkimu ba'boker. They got up in the morning. Vayalu el rosh ha'har lemar. And they walked to the top of the mountain and they said, Hinenu, here we are. V'yolinu ha'makom asher amar Hashem ki chatanu. We will go up to the place that God said, for we have sinned. For we have sinned. We were wrong. We did the wrong thing. Moshe said, why would you do this? Why would you violate God's word? You will not succeed. Al talu, do not go up. Lest you be routed by the enemies. The Amalekites and the Canaanites are there. When the Faltem Becharav, you will fall by the sword. Ken Shavtem Me'acharei Hashem V'lo yeh Hashem imochem. You have turned back from God. You refuse to do what God initially commanded you to do. God will not be with you. Nonetheless, Vayapilu. Vayapilu is a difficult word. They translate defiantly, or they insisted. La'alot el rosh hahar, to go to the top of the mountain. V'aron brit Hashem u'Moshe lo moshu mikerev ha'machaneh. But the ark of God, the ark of the covenant, and Moshe stayed behind. Vayered ha'amaleki v'aknani hayoshe b'harahu. Vayakum vayaktum ad Charmah. The Amalekites and the Canaanites that dwelled on the mountain came and dealt them a shattering blow at a place called Charmah. So this is the parallel story. This is known as the story of the Mapilim, the defiant ones. Moshe said, "Don't go. God doesn't want you to go." Vayapilu lalot rosh hahar, but they insisted. They defiantly went to the top of the mountain and they fight, and they are routed and defeated by the Amalekites and by the Canaanites. So we have two stories that are very similar, but there are some differences between the two stories. They're not identical. And it is interesting that in Moshe's retelling in our book in Devarim, he mentions the story of these Mapilim. He does mention them. He doesn't use the word Mapilim, but this is the parallel story. Now, first of all, what is the difference between the two stories? There are several differences between the two stories. And when we're reading the book of Devarim, again, one of the questions we're always asking is, why mention this particular story? Why is this such an important story? Of course, the story of the Mapilim sort of seals the fate of the first generation, the ones who left Egypt, the slaves in Egypt. This seals their fate. They're defeated in a place called Charmah. Here, by the way, you notice, no doubt, that in the account in Sefer Bamidbar, the peoples who are attacking them, who defeat them, are the Amalekites, Amalek, and also Canaan. The Amalekites and the Canaanites. In our version of the story, right? In our version of the story, in chapter 1, it is the Amori. It's the Amorites. In the account in Bamidbar, it's the Canaanites and the Amalekites. That's one difference between the two stories. Then there's another difference between the two stories. That in the book of Bamidbar, Moshe tells them the news, and the people are mourning, and the people say, we're going to go up to the place. We're going to nonetheless go up to the place. Ki chatanu. We recognize we sinned. Moshe says, don't do it, but they do it anyway. In our account in Sefer Devarim, the first thing they say is, before anything, right? Vatanu v'atomu elai chatanu l'Hashem. The first they say is chatanu. We have sinned, right? And we're going to do whatever God commanded us to do. And they put on their war gear, and then Moshe says to them, don't do it, right? Don't disobey God's word. And nonetheless, and they come and cry before God, and God pays no attention. So the two stories are obviously parallel stories, but there is this difference between the two stories. And what is the focus? Let's say in our book, what is the point over here? What's the focus? The first thing they say is Chatanu Hashem. The first words out of their mouth. They confess. We confess our sins, and we're going to do the right thing now. We were commanded to fight earlier, and now we're willing to do it. But the response is basically, you can't do it anymore. It's too late because God is not going to accompany you. And without God's accompaniment, you cannot succeed. So what is the message over here that we have in our story? What is the message that's being delivered over here? How do you read this?
That you need to listen to God. You have to do it on his terms. You can't decide on your own. It reminds me of the story of Nadav and Avihu. You have to do it according to the strictures that God sets down, or it's not kosher.
I agree with that. It's hard to disagree with that, for sure. I mean, but I guess my point is, why you would expect when people say chatanu, right? I mean, they're confessing their sins, but it seems to make no difference. And not only that, when they come back later after the defeat and they cry then, God pays no attention.
That doesn't absolve you.
What?
That doesn't absolve you.
Doesn't absolve you after the fact, you're saying?
Well, it absolved.
Yeah.
It absolved David HaMelech. So I get David's point. He's saying, why doesn't the magic chatanu make a difference here?
But the baby dies, even in David's story.
That is
Yeah,
true.
well, that's a punishment for other people. I mean, but there's a consequence or not a consequence to the people who sinned, even if they said chatanu. It's a scary concept.
Yeah, I mean, let me say the following. I actually agree with, yes, someone else has. I'm with you.
They are acting in a foolhardy way. They are not, their chotono is belied by their rash activity thereafter. They are not seriously considering what happened. It's a sudden erasure of their previous sin. So, okay, then let's go now.
Okay, right. I think that's actually a very important point. In other
No,
words,
it's too facile. It's too facile a comment. In other words, there wasn't enough time for them to have fallen on their faces and really understood it. Is that what he's trying to say?
right. Well, I'll get back to him in 1 second. Sigrid, you want to say something?
Is this also a comment on Moshe's leadership? That they kind of defied him and didn't listen?
I think that's certainly the case, that Moshe is, I mean, yeah, that Moshe, I think it is a comment on Moshe's leadership, and probably one of the reasons that he can't move forward. I think Moshe's time is up, basically. But by the way, in the book of Bamidbar, there are several attacks on Moshe's leadership, beginning in chapter 11. The two attacks in chapter 11. There's Miriam and Aaron's attack on him in chapter 12. There's the story of the spies, and then you have Korach. It's one story after the next. So basically, Moshe has lost, to some extent, has lost control of the people.
Yeah.
I do want to respond to just a couple of points. First of all, I do agree with that the word chatasi is not sufficient. In other words, it's a beginning. And the story that comes to my mind is actually not the story of King David, but rather King Saul. When he fails to kill Amalek, and the prophet says to him, God has rejected you or whatever, and then Saul says, okay, chatasi, now come back with me. And Samuel says, I'm not going to go back with you. The idea that to restore the relationship, it's not just enough to say chatasi, but it has to be you need a response from the other side, which in this case you don't have. The people are willing to try to mend the relationship, but what God is saying is this is not a relationship that can be mended. And the reason it can't be mended is because what God seems to be saying is that you're not ready for this. The very fact that you were unwilling to move forward, which shows a lack of faith in me. I took you out of Egypt. I brought all the miracles. I brought you to this place. Obviously, you don't understand the whole trajectory, and therefore, you can't enter because it's time is not right for you to enter. Your children will enter, but you can't enter. I think that's the message over here. I don't think that chatati alone is actually sufficient. Yes, in the case of David, the difference between the case of David and the case over here, I would say, is the following: that in the case of over here, and the case of Saul, okay, I sinned. I recognize the sin. Now let's move forward. Now David doesn't say let's move forward. David only says two words: Chatati Hashem. I sinned. That's all I have to say. So the ball's in your court. You do whatever you wish. Now David does suffer afterwards, loses 4 children, etc. But I think what bothers, what the Chumash is, we sinned and now we're going to go. And
Rabbi Silber.
That step is inappropriate.
Rabbi
Yes.
Silber, it's so interesting because when Aharon said after the Egel, Moshe said, okay, now let's go do the Karbanot. And Aharon said, no, Hashem's not really ready for us. So the same, actually, Moshe was quick to go.
Right. In the story, after which story?
After the Egel. I think it's after the Egel.
There's a story later on when the dedication of the temple, when Aaron refuses to go forward. He says, I'm not.
Right. That Hashem is still angered with them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. So Aaron is right. Aaron gives an excuse at the time, but later on, and certainly in the text, he seems that he feels it's inappropriate for him to move forward. The point I wanted to push over here is the following point. First of all, the first point I think is an important point, that one way to read the story is it's not even a punishment. It's more like it makes no sense. You can't possess the land because obviously you're not ready. It's going to take 40 years for the next generation to actually get ready. And then Moshe's job is over the 40 years to work with the people. But there's something else interesting about this Pilim story in the book of Devarim. And I wanted to point this out. It's not actually in chapter 1, but there's something very striking in chapter 2. Chapter 2 is, okay, chapter 2 begins the 38 years of wandering in the desert. And this wandering takes place, and we're told in chapter 2, if you take a look at chapter 2, verse number 14, you see, there it says the following. It says, Hayomim asher holachnu mikodesh bar. We'll go back to these verses. Hayomim asher holachnu mikodesh barneya. Ad asher avarnu et nachal zered shloshim u'shmoneh shana. They wandered 38 years in the desert. Ad tom kol hadar. Anshei hamilchama mikerev hamachaneh kashem nishba Hashem lahem. V'gam yad Hashem hoyta bam u'hubam mikerev hamachaneh atumam. Vayhi kasher tamu kol anshei hamilchama lomut mikerev ha'am vaydeber Hashem elai lemar. So what's very striking in these verses is, it says this: they wandered for 38 years in the desert until what? Until the generation, the door. Anshei HaMilchama, the men of war had all died. It calls the generation that leaves Egypt Anshei HaMilchama, the men of war. It calls them that in verse number 14, and it calls them that again in verse number 16. Now I want to ask you a question. If we would describe the generation, the slaves that left the land of Egypt, would we call them Anshei HaMilchama, the generation of the fighters, the military men that left the land of Egypt? I mean, you read this and you say to yourself, this is one of the strangest descriptions of the slaves that left Egypt. And remember the very beginning when they're leaving Egypt, what did the Torah say? God didn't take them by the way of the Philistines, right? Lest they encounter war and go back to Egypt. These are hardly warriors. These aren't warriors. They have what battle did they fight? They fought against Amalek, that is true. That's a battle against Amalek. But I don't think in describing this people as the generation that leaves Egypt, the slaves who want to return, we would call this generation Anshei HaMilchama. The generation I would call Anshei HaMilchama is the next generation, their children. Their children actually are warriors. And they're led by a warrior named Yoshua ben Nun. And they're going to fight battles, they're going to possess a land. And by the way, you see this very distinction between the two generations in the book of Bamidbar. Because in the book of Bamidbar, in the verse we read before, when the first generation, the Mapilim, they went to the top of the mountain and they fought against the Canaanites and the Amalekites. And they were defeated like in a place called Charmah. That's the end of chapter 14 of Sefer Bamidbar. And then the book of Bamidbar, that's the first generation. That's the generation of slaves. That's the Mapilim. And then we have the Korach rebellion. Then we have the death of the first generation. Chapter 20, the death of the first generation. Miriam dies, Aaron dies. And then we have another story, chapter 21, the beginning of chapter 21. So chapter 20 is the death of Miriam and Aaron, the death of the first generation. Now you have the new generation has emerged in the desert. And there's 3 verses in the beginning of chapter 21. Bamidbar chapter 21. Vayishma Knani Melech Arad Yoshev HaNegev. Ki ba Yisrael derech Atarim. The Canaanite king of Arad heard that Israel was traveling by way of Atarim. Vayilachem b'Yisrael. He fought against Israel. Vayish b'menu shev. He took hostages. Vayidai Yisrael neder Hashem vayomar. And Israel took a vow to God and saying, if you will hand this nation over to me, I will utterly destroy their cities or dedicate their cities. And God heard the voice of Israel. God listened to Israel. God obeyed Israel, as it were. And they destroyed the cities. And the name of the place was Charmah, which means destruction or dedication. So we're very struck by something. Chapter 14, the Mapilim, those are the Jews that left the land of Egypt, the slaves. They insist on fighting against the Canaanites, and they're defeated in a place called Charmah. And then in chapter 21, there's another battle in Charmah, this time a victorious battle of Israel. In the first instance, you remember what it said about the war? That Moshe and the ark did not go with the people. Aaron brit Hashemu Moshe or Moshe mikarev hamachaneh. In the second instance, though, there's no mention of Moshe at all. There's no mention of the ark. It's a vow that the people take. Moshe is not mentioned. And God listened, God heeded Israel's voice. Yet God gave Israel victory. And the place was called Charmah. The difference between the two stories is this. The first story is about the first generation. They're defeated in Charmah. And they need the ark, and they need Moshe. But the second generation, there's no ark and there's no Moshe. The second generation does it on their own. They bring God with them by means of a vow, Vayidai Yisrael Neder, and they defeat the Canaanites, and they defeat them in the place called Charmah. And what's striking to me is, if we got to pick a generation that are men of war, warriors, it's certainly not the first generation. it is certainly the second generation. And now we come back to our book, Sefer Dvarim. And the point I wanted to make about Sefer Dvarim, which touches upon the very point I made in the beginning of the class today, which is Moshe is talking to the second generation. It's the 40th year of the desert. He's talking about the first generation as men of war. And he's saying to the people, to his audience, you know, the men of war, they thought they could do it on their own. But the men of war can't do it without God's help. As mighty warriors as they may be, we always need God's assistance. Or maybe even more than God's assistance, we need to know we're fighting a just war. Because God is not going to assist us in an unjust war. God only assists us in a just war. So therefore, the message that he's given, he's talking about he's talking about those people, the generation of the warriors. But who was he actually talking to? He's actually not talking to them. He's talking to the generation who actually are warriors. And he's making a very important point, which is the theme in this book, is a basic theme in Sefer Devarim. The basic theme, I don't want to say the basic theme, but a basic theme of Sefer Devarim is, don't think you can do it by yourself. Or in the words of the Sefer Devarim letter, Kochi v'otzim yadi. And Sefer Devarim is talking to the second generation. And the second generation has a problem, and the first generation has a problem. The problem of the first generation, generally speaking, was they didn't fail to take responsibility. They are afraid. They are frightened. They can't do it by themselves. They were saved at the sea. They did nothing. We witnessed God's hand at the sea. What did we do? We did nothing, essentially. So basically, we want to go back to Mitzrayim. It's a slave mentality. That's the problem with the first generation, the slave mentality. The second generation has the opposite problem, because they were never slaves. They never want to go back to Egypt. Why would they want to go back to Egypt? They were never in Egypt. They have no illusions about the old country. That's, which is an illusion, but it's a similar illusion. Egypt was great. We had a lot of watermelons and cucumbers there. And the point is, and we had no responsibilities. Yes, we were beaten, we were oppressed, it's true, but we had no responsibilities. That's the first generation. But the second generation were never in Egypt to begin with. They have a different problem. Why are we dawdling in the desert? We'll see this. Why are we wasting time in the desert? Let's go capture the land already. The Anshe HaMilchama. And the message over here that Moshe is speaking to these people, ostensibly about the first generation, but he's talking to these people, he's talking to you. He's talking to the second generation, and he's saying, listen, they maybe were great warriors, but without God's help, and I would say without God's justifying the war, it has to be a just war. And without just war, we're not going to succeed. And the one who determines the just war is God, actually. God says it's not a just war, you don't fight the war, period. This is not a war we're going to fight now. For God's reasons, because you're not ready, because of whatever. And therefore, when God says don't fight a war, you can't fight that war. So that's what Moshe is saying over here. The Anshe HaMilchama. He calls this first generation of slaves Anshe HaMilchama, Dar HaMilchama.
Rabbi Silber,
Yes.
how about modern day Hakotel Biadenu? We don't want to fault them too much, but still.
The modern day, to figure out what a just war is always an issue.
Yeah.
And, how to conduct war, just war, and all
Right.
that.
But I mean, Hakotel Biadenu, people criticize them, that they didn't say Hashem.
That's true.
Mm.
There's all kinds of, I'm not getting into the present politics at all and situation, but the fact is, in the Chumash, it's very clear. And what Moshe does over here, what the book is doing, actually, it's always important to remember, the primary audience are the children. It's the 40th year. The other people died in the desert. But what Moshe is talking about, the Jewish people, he's not separating. He's in a way, he's saying we're all one people. That's what Moshe is really saying. That the generation that left Mitzrayim and the generation that's to possess the land, the book doesn't see, they're two separate generations, no question about it. But we're also connected to the first generation. We're moving the project forward. So when the book speaks about to the people, he's primarily addressing the people who stand in front of him, the words of Moshe, but he often talks as if these people were also in Egypt. We'll see this later on. He talks all the time. You saw in Egypt. Most of them were never in Egypt, but their parents were in Egypt. So there's something interesting about the book. On one hand, it's one people, but on the other hand, the primary audience is actually the children, and not the adults.
So, Rabbi,
And I suggest he talks about Anshe Milchama, but he's really referring to these people who actually are Anshe Milchama. He's making a very important point about the war. It's got to be a war in which God is involved. That is to say, God justifies it. God will assist you. It has to be God. God has a plan. We have to carry out God's plan. And if we do it for other purposes, that's not God's plan. We can't expect to be victorious, because without God's help, we're not going to be victorious. Let me make one other point about this. There's a lot to say about it, but I want to make the following. Just one second.
Generation then is the Anshe HaMilchama. Is it in fact the first generation, which was what surprised us? Or is it in fact that we're both the same, that we sort of conflate, and that we are both Anshe HaMilchama?
No, what I'm suggesting is the real Anshe HaMilchama. If you had to pick that term, Anshe HaMilchama, I would say it's the second generation. They're the ones who are going to fight. They're the ones who defeat the Canaanite king at Arad.
Right.
And they're the ones that are going to possess the land. The book of Devarim has a whole section about war in it.
Right. So
the
why
laws of Sefer Devarim, the real Anshe HaMilchama are the second generation. But Moshe calls the first generation Anshe HaMilchama because he wants to make a point about Anshe HaMilchama. The Anshe HaMilchama failed because God was not with them. And when you're fighting a war, you got to make. By the way, later on in this book, it talks about war. There are all kinds of rules of war in this book, and the first thing is when you go to war. We'll see this later on, hopefully, and whenever we get there, the Kohen comes and says, "Don't be afraid, because God is fighting as well." The first thing the priest says. In other words, when you go into war, you want to go into war where you're quite sure that God approves of the war. And the Anshe HaMilchama in the instance over here, God did not approve. God said explicitly, "Don't go, do not go," but they go anyway. And Moshe says they may have been very great warriors, says Moshe, but nonetheless they couldn't succeed. But the real statement is to the people he's talking to: you actually are great warriors, but don't delude yourself into thinking that's sufficient. Don't think you can do it by yourself without God's assistance, which is, as I point out, the basic theme of this book. That's the basic concern of Moshe. You're gonna think you do it by yourself. You're gonna become complacent. You're gonna become, satisfied with yourselves, etc., etc. That's the basic theme of the book.
And that's also the emphasis in Yoshua, that it's God who is doing the fighting, and it's with the help or with the assistance, more than assistance. It's God who's doing the fighting mostly.
Right. You have in Sefer Yoshua, by the way, it's a very interesting point I came across recently in sort of redoing the Haggadah. You have the very end of Sefer Yoshua, rather most remarkable speech of Yoshua, which the Haggadah, Passover Haggadah, quotes the beginning of. It's which is the beginning of Yoshua's long speech. And there Yoshua rewrites history. There Yoshua talks about the fact that God has sent the Tzirah to defeat the enemies. I mean, the book of Yoshua is about all these battles that armies are fighting. But the end of the last chapter of the book, Yoshua tells a different story about how we succeed in capturing the land. It was all God that did the fighting, which is very striking. So obviously, at the point of Devarim, and Yoshua and Sefer Devarim are joined together, obviously. So the point is, I'm making one simple point. Sometimes you talk about somebody else, but you're addressing a certain person, but you don't say you. You're talking about somebody else, but you're really talking about the person in front of you. You're talking about somebody else, but the real audience is the guy in front of you. And that's the point over here. The real message is, you people, you fighters, you warriors, don't delude yourself into thinking you can do it by yourself, which, as I said, is the theme that repeats itself throughout this book. I know what you think. You think you can do it by yourself. Kochi v'yotzem yodi. It doesn't work that way, and that will lead you down a very bad path. So that's the message over here. In any event, just to summarize what we have so far, so Moshe is not. It's not about telling history, because there's a lot of events he doesn't mention. he's talking about the beginnings of the second generation, which takes place after the episode of the spies. First generation is not going to succeed. You will enter the land. You're going to wander for 40 years, so I can teach you, says Moshe. And these are the lessons that I want you to learn. This is the second episode. You have the spy episode. You have the Mapilim, and now going back to Sefer Devarim, we have the following. So the people are to wander in the desert. And in chapter 2, right, it says the following. We'll just begin now, and next week we'll pick this up. This is most interesting. Here, the contradictions abound between what it says here and what it said earlier in the Torah. We'll get to it. It says, "Vanefin vanisa mebar derech Yamsuf, kasher diber Hashem Elai, vanosav et har seir yamim rabim." So we can't march into the land. We go by way of the Yamsuf, and we skirted the hill of Seir. Seir is Edom. So we're coming close to the land of Edom. And now I have the following statement, which will start now. Chapter 2, verse number 3. Vayomer, verse number 3. Verse number 2, I'm sorry. Verse number 2. Vayomer Hashem Elai lemar, Rav lachem sovet tahara zeh, pnu lachem tzafona. You have skirted the hill country long enough. Travel north. V'yeta'am tzav lemar. Atem ovrim b'gvul achechem b'nei Esav hayoshvim b'seir. V'yiru bikem. V'nishmartem ma'od. Al titgaru bam. Ki lo etein lochem me'yatzam ad midrach kaf ragel. Ki Yerusha Esav natati et har seir. Ochel tishbru me'itam b'kesef v'achaltem. V'gamayim tichlu me'itam b'kesef ushtitem. What does God say? Says Moshe, God said to me, tell the people, travel north. You're going to pass by the border of your brother Esav. They're going to be very afraid of you. Do not be very careful. Do not provoke them. I will not give you any of their land, not even a foot tread. That land belongs to Esav. You may purchase for that. You may buy from them food and eat. And you can also obtain water for money. That's what it says over here, right? And it says that's what they did. Now we have a problem with this. We have two problems, actually. And we'll start with this next week. First of all, when you read this over here, you're going to be near the land of Esav. They're very afraid of you. Do not provoke them. Do not start up with them. Do not harm them. You're not allowed to hurt them, because their land belongs to them. I gave them their land, but you can purchase. You can buy food, you can buy water, everything for money. That's what it says over here. One small problem we have, and we'll start with this next week. When you read the verses in the book of Bamidbar, one gets quite a very different impression. One does not get the impression that Esav is afraid of Bnei Yisrael. Quite the opposite. In the story over there, Israel says to Esav, let us pass through your land. We're just going to pass through. We're not going to bother anybody. Esav says, no way. And the people send the message. We'll see this next week. The first message was sent by Moshe. Then the people send the message. Listen, we'll go on the side road. If we eat anything, we'll pay for it. What does Esav do? They send out their army. And Israel goes away. So there's no sense that they're afraid of us. There's no sense that, quite the opposite, they're going to send their army out. There is no sense we actually bought food or bought water from them. On the contrary, we left. When you read the verses over here, one gets exactly the opposite impression, that they're afraid of us, that you can purchase food and water. And we'll see later on in Devarim, it seems to say that we did purchase food and water. So we have over here a blatant contradiction between the two stories. That's one thing. But more important for our purposes, we want to understand what is going on in the second chapter of Sefer Devarim. The story in chapter 2 of Sefer Devarim has very clear references in the book of Bamidbar. Our interest will be in seeing what is the message that emerges from the Devarim chapter 2, which is not found in Bamidbar. What is the core message? The contradictions I'm not sure we're able to resolve. But what is the point of this chapter? We have so far the pointing of judges, the spies, and the Mapilim story. And now we have the journey which skirts these different countries. It skirts Esav, which is Edom. It's going to skirt Ammon. It's going to skirt Moab. And finally, the war against Sichon at the end of chapter 2. That'll be our topic for next week. Let me stop you and take any comments or questions.
I would like to highlight some really good questions that came up in chat earlier.
Yes.
Just from Jessica Kurzban about 15 minutes ago, quote, "It's not just that it was one quick word, we sinned, but that by again initiating human action instead of waiting to follow a divine commandment, right after admitting that is the wrongdoing, the lesson wasn't learned, it was repeated."
I agree with that 1,000%. Yes. I think we made that point. That is very correct. Yeah. It's saying I sinned and now it's okay. And that's not the right way.
Stacy Lehman asked about 45 minutes ago, so when we move through Tanakh, are we moving from intimate first person to a more distant perspective?
I would say certainly in the Torah that's true. I would say yes. I would say that. I mean, I will deal with that question more in detail. That's a very important question. I think it is true. I think when you settle into the land, it's what Shlomo HaMelech says when he dedicates the temple. He says God is not in the temple. We'll get to this later on. This is a fundamental theme of Sefer Devarim. It's the place that God has chosen to place God's name there. Lasumet Shemisham. God's name is there. God is not there. God is not in the temple. Not in Sefer Devarim. God is in heaven. Hashkif Mimon Kachcha Min Hashemayim. Shlomo said it explicitly. You will hear us in heaven. The temple is a communication center, from which God picks up the mail, or somehow it gets beamed to heaven. But God in the books of the Torah, books of the Bible, following Sefer Devarim, God is not inside the temple. God is in the temple in Vayikra, maybe in Bamidbar, but God is not in the temple in Sefer Devarim. I think that's a really very important point, which has many different implications, and we'll deal with this as we go through the book of Devarim. But I think that's a true statement. It's certainly true in the Torah. The God of Devarim is not the same God as Vayikra. God is very distant. You visit 3 times a year. God doesn't dwell amongst us in Sefer Devarim. I'll have to stop at this point. You can always email me, dsilber@drisha.org. We'll continue next week with chapter 2, which has all kinds of interesting features to it. Looking forward to that.
All right. Thank you,
Okay, then.
everyone. I just want to highlight we have a bunch of classes starting this week as part of Fall Zman, including but not limited to the moral philosophy of Rav Isaac Hutner with Rabbi Alex Ozar. This class will meet on Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern U.S. time. How Poskim Come to Know Reality with Rabbi Jonathan Ziering. This is on Wednesday afternoons at 12 p.m. Eastern time, as well as and on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time with Rachel Schultz, Blessings in Everyday Moments, History, Meaning, and Practice. I'd be very glad to see any of you at any of these classes, and you can sign up at drisha.org/classes. Take care, everyone.